Hello, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to part 7 of the Life Theory Lab lecture series. The lecture series is part of the educational program of the International Max Planck Research School of the Life course Life, and it is organized by Markus Wertel-Bergner, Imke Kruse, and Ulmer Lindenberg. My name is Thorsten Pachur, and together with Markus Wertel-Bergner, I'll be hosting the lecture today. And it's a great pleasure that we have Danielle Bassett from the University of Pennsylvania today, talking about the structure-function couplings in human brain development. As usual, we have 45 minutes for the talk, followed by about 30 minutes of discussion. And for the discussion, the fellows of the live program have priority to ask questions. So if you have a question, please indicate so by posting it under the questions channel of the webinar software, and Markus and I will be moderating through the questions in the discussion after the talk. And before we turn to the introduction of today's speaker, let me remind you that this session will be recorded. So for the live fellows, please switch off your video if you prefer not to appear on the video. And to all of you, if you don't want to be recorded when you ask a question, just post your question in the channel, and then we'll try to paraphrase the question as good as we can. Thanks, Danielle, for being with us today, and Laura Buchinger will introduce our today's speaker.
Yeah, thank you. I have the honor today to present to you Professor Danielle Bassett, who is a professor of bioengineering and runs the Complex Systems Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a shining star of interdisciplinary research, and hence, I believe, a perfect speaker for a life theory lab session. She is affiliated with 5 departments, as you can see on her first slide. She has a background in physics, receiving her bachelor's degree also from the University of Pennsylvania. She completed her doctoral studies at the University of Cambridge under the supervision of Edward Bulmore and Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg. She then accepted a postdoctoral position at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she was also a SAGE Fellow with Michael Gazzaniga. Professor Bassett is still an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. She has received numerous awards and prizes for her work in different fields, including obviously engineering and complex system science. For example, in 2017, she received the Lagrange Prize. But she was also the American Psychological Society Rising Star in 2012. She was the youngest person to be awarded a MacArthur Fellowships. So these are just 3 examples of a long list of awards. Professor Bassett has applied the concepts of network science and complex systems to understanding the organization of the human brain and ultimately human thought. Her research interests include, amongst other things, brain modularity and flexibility, knowledge architecture, and more broadly, the relationship between brain networks and dynamic cognitive processes like learning and adaptation. So yeah, a warm welcome to you, Professor Bassett. We're very excited to have you here, and the virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and also for the opportunity to be here with you all today. As I was looking through the really amazing set of talks and goals of the Life Theory Lab, I thought a little bit more about what I could tell you that's really new and different, and something that tries to blend theory and human behavior in the tightest coupling that we've been able to do so far. And so I decided today to tell you about a series of studies that we've published over the last very few years, trying to understand the architectures, the network architectures that support learnability. So the focus of this talk is going to be the coupling of theory and behavior. Brain is in there, but it is not the main player on this stage yet, although that's coming in the near future. So to begin, I just wanted to say that, in my lab, we have many different areas of work. We study human collective behavior, we study granular and particulate networks. We have a new line of work in control of brain networks and trying to understand when you perturb a brain, what happens, how does that perturbation pass through the pattern of connections that exists inside of a brain. We also have studies in control of mechanical networks, in network conservation, evolution, and development, and finally in this area of learning and network behaviors. And the lab itself, I think, even though this might sound like a very different set of studies, each of these are interdigitated and examples of studying complex systems with a very similar approach, trying to work at the intersection of theory development and real study of the questions that are important for a particular system. And so today, what I'm going to focus on is this last section, learning and network behaviors. And to do that, I wanted to start with a story. So this is a story that is recounted in Robert Macfarlane's book called Landmarks. Robert Macfarlane is a professor at the University of Cambridge in England, and he remembers inviting his mentor, Roger Deakin, to Cambridge to give a talk. Deakin is an English writer and documentary maker on waterways. And so Macfarlane invited Deakin to Cambridge to give a talk on his work, and he was hoping that Deakin would give a really impressive talk, and everybody at Cambridge would think that Macfarlane was great because the mentor was great. Unfortunately, the day didn't go according to plan, and this is his memory of what actually happened on that day. So he says, "I stared dedicatedly at my shoes, embarrassed that my friend was failing to perform in front of my academic peers. It was only later that I realized it wasn't a failure to perform, but a refusal to conform. Cambridge seminars expect rigor and logic from their speakers, a braced subtlety of exposition and explanation, and tested proofs of cause and consequence. But water, which was Roger's subject, doesn't do rigor in that sense, and neither did Roger, though his writing was often magnificently precise in his poetry. For Roger, water flowed fast and wildly through culture. It was protean, it was slip-shape, and so that was how he followed it, slipshod and ship-shape at once, moving from a word here to an idea there, pursuing water's influence too fast for his notes or his audience to keep up with, joining his watery subjects by means of an invisible network of tunnels and drains." And what I think is really fascinating about this passage is that it is suggesting that Roger came and gave a talk in a manner, in an architecture that was consistent with the architecture of his subject. So his subject is water, and he gave a rather watery lecture, one that sort of flowed in this invisible network of tunnels and drains. It flowed fast, it flowed wildly, too fast for people to keep up with, not following his notes, etc. And this makes me think a lot about what it is that we transmit when we lecture, but maybe more generally when we communicate with one another. And I think what we are communicating is a network, not necessarily a network of tunnels and drains, as in Roger's case, but a network of concepts, a network of ideas. And when we learn, we are receiving a network of concepts or ideas. And this idea that knowledge is a network is certainly not a new one. It's not something I came up with. It's been in the literature for a long time. And in fact, if you go back to Henri Poincaré's 1905 Science and Hypothesis, you can find this passage where he says, "The aim of science is not things themselves, as the dogmatists in their simplicity imagine, but the relations among things. Outside these relations, there is no reality knowable." And then John Dewey in 1916 in his Democracy and Education really says it very forthrightly when he says, "Knowledge is a perception of those connections of an object which determine its applicability in a given situation. Thus we get at a new event indirectly instead of immediately by invention, ingenuity, and resourcefulness. And ideally perfect knowledge would represent such a network of interconnections that any past experience would offer a point of advantage from which to get at the problem presented in a new experience." So certainly this idea that knowledge may be a network is not new. But the second idea that comes out of that passage from Roger Deakin is that knowledge is possibly a network that's learned by example. So we present a network in the way that we speak, in the way that we communicate, in the way that we act, and then others learn that network by watching us or by listening to us. So we could, let's stick close to the lecture idea just for a little bit longer, and then we'll expand out later. But let's suppose that I'm giving a lecture at Penn to an undergraduate class in linear algebra, let's say. Suppose I have to translate 15 ideas to the class. And
sorry.
Yes.
It almost feels like everything out there is like amplified in here, like my typing and like everything. Put it on and then listen to me type when I...
I'm sorry, should I continue?
Yes.
I will continue. Okay, so here are those 15 ideas. Those 15 ideas are related to one another in a heterogeneous manner, making a network, as you see on the left-hand side. So what I have to do is to translate that information linearly, because time is one-dimensional and unidirectional, meaning I can only say one word in front of the next, and I can only walk through one concept before I can walk through the next one. So there's always a linear, one-dimensional, unidirectional flow of information from me to someone else. So what's challenging is that I have to create this information time series from this pretty complex architecture in some way that maximizes learning. So to make that idea a little bit more concrete and to show you why this is hard and why it's amazing that humans can do this and learn to do this over their lifetime, I wanted to show you this picture. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing the brain of the speaker or the writer that has this network architecture of knowledge inside of their mind. And then on the right-hand side is the brain of the listener or reader. So what we need to do, there are a couple challenges here. One is to map the ideas of the speaker or writer into this line, this string of concepts traversed in time, in such a way that the brain of the listener or reader can optimally reconstruct what that high dimensional object was. Now, there's what is the best map? Interesting question. What is the best string of concepts? What is the best reconstruction algorithm? How does a human, as they develop, learn how to draw that map or learn what that optimal reconstruction algorithm is? It's an interesting question, and it's actually not something that's just related to lecturing. It's actually something that's much more general. So this problem of inferring the pattern of pairwise dependencies from incoming streams of data, so those pairwise dependencies that make up a network architecture, is actually something that allows us as humans to learn language, to segment visual events, to parse tonal groupings, to parse spatial scenes, to infer social networks, and to perceive distinct concepts. So it's much, much, much more general than just what happens when we lecture or when we listen to a lecture. But how does it happen, and how have humans figured out how to do this? In order to answer those types of questions, we need to have an experimental apparatus that would allow us to study the human perception of network topology from a continuous stream of information. So we need a laboratory task that would let us assess this question. So what we do is that we take something like this network that you see here, and let's let each stimulus be a node on the graph. And that stimulus could be a word, an image, a movement, and then the edges in this graph would indicate an allowable transition between two nodes. So an allowable transition between two words or two concepts, two images, two movements. Then what we need is a way of walking through this graph that makes sense. And what we can do just as an initial pass is that we can construct a sequence of stimuli by taking a random walk on the graph. So we'll take stimulus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, defined by taking a random walk inside of this graph. We can obviously use walks that are not random as well, that have other sorts of constraints on top of them. But for now, I'm just going to stick with a random walk because later it will become very helpful in our development of the theory. And the last thing that we need is a way for the human participant to respond to us so that we can understand to what degree they have learned that network architecture. So what we do is that we say that at each stimulus, we require the participant to perform a little task so that their time to react can be used as a measure of how well that edge in the graph was actually learned. So here is an example experimental setup. We've done these sorts of studies when using stimuli that are movements, stimuli that are visual, and then stimuli that have a social context to them. And for the next few slides, I'm just going to focus on the motor version just because it's simple to explain. But if you're curious about these others, the papers are available and you can look them up. So in the motor context, what we can do is we can say, well, one stimulus is just a set of 5 boxes with 1 or 2 boxes highlighted. So here's an example on the left-hand side where the top stimulus is highlighted, so that means press the pinky button. And then in the next stimulus, there are 2 boxes that are highlighted, so that means press 1 and 3. And then the third stimulus has, again, 2 boxes highlighted, so that means press 3 and 4 together, etc. And this sequence of stimuli is defined by taking a random walk on a graph that we as the experimentalists have defined, but the human participant never sees and never knows what architecture is there. All they see is a sequence of stimuli, similar to how when we give a lecture, there's a sequence of words, but there's not an explicit presentation of what the network architecture of the ideas is. Okay. So now, before we get into what we've learned that's new, we want to ask, what do we already know about this problem? So what we already know about this problem from work in the field of statistical learning and the study of artificial grammars is that humans are sensitive to transition probabilities. And what that means is that if you're sitting at stimulus A and 75% of the time in your environment, stimulus A moves to stimulus B, then anytime that you see A, you will immediately think that B is coming. So for example, when we see a flash of lightning, we anticipate that thunder will boom. And because of those two things happen very frequently next to one another, we generate an anticipation of their relationship and their transition probability. So in following from that, we also know that if you're sitting at stimulus A and 25% of the time you go to stimulus C, then when you're at A, you'll mostly expect B, but you'll partially expect C as well. Now, a corollary to this observation is that when you're currently sitting at A, and if in your world only 2 outcomes ever arrive after A, then you'll expect each of them about 50% of the time. If instead you're in an environment where A can lead to 3 different outcomes, then when you're sitting at A, you'll expect each of those 3 outcomes about 33% of the time, right? So what that means is that when you're sitting at A and there are 3 possible outcomes that happen in your world, then your expectation of each of them is a little bit lower, your uncertainty is higher, and you will respond more slowly. If on the other hand, you're sitting at A and you're in this world that only 2 outcomes exist, then you're going to expect each of them 50% of the time. You have higher certainty and you will respond more quickly to either of them. Okay, so here is just a demonstration that that effect holds in this kind of experiment in a very, very nice way. So what you see here is that the human reaction time along the y-axis, and this is in milliseconds, and along the x-axis is the entropy of your spot in the graph, your current spot in the graph. The entropy is equal to the log of the degree of node I, so degree being k, so ki is the degree of node I, which means the number of possible outcomes from that node. So what you can see is that if you're sitting at a node and only 1 outcome ever happens, your reaction time is very fast. Because you have very little uncertainty and you can respond immediately. You know precisely what will always happen after that point. On the right-hand side of the graph, what you're seeing is that if you're sitting at a node in this graph that has many different edges coming out of it, and so therefore many different possible outcomes that you've seen in the past, then your reaction time will be slow because there's a lot of uncertainty and you don't know which of the 14 options will happen next. And this line is first of all, quite nice, but second of all, that has a slope of 32 milliseconds per bit, which means that the average human in one of these experiments tends to process 1 bit of information in this graph with about 32 milliseconds. It's an open question right now to what degree that precise measure varies over development, and that's something that we're extremely interested in studying as a follow-up to this, is, do we process this kind of information differently and with different lengths of time as humans develop? Okay, but we also find something new that is not predicted by what we have previously learned from statistical learning or the study of artificial grammars, and that is that human reaction times depend on much more than just entropy. And to show you that, I'm showing you a graph where the entropy at each node is the same. So at every node, there are exactly 4 connections coming out of it, which means that when you're sitting at any point in this graph, you know that you will come to expect that there will be 4 possible outcomes. And if humans were simply responsive to that transition probability, that sort of 25% chance of moving to something else, then their reaction times across the entire graph should be the same. We should see a completely flat picture here. But what we see is something very, very different than flat. What I'm showing you in color is the reaction time of the human participants on each of these transitions. And what you can see is that humans are very swift in responding to transitions inside of one of these little clusters and very slow to respond to transitions at the boundary between two clusters. So that's suggesting that there's something more than entropy that humans are observing, and in fact that they're somehow intuiting or perceiving the higher order structure in the network, not just the local structure, which is fixed or the same. Every node has exactly 4 connections. Okay, so humans are sensitive to something beyond entropy, and it seems that they're actually sensitive to something beyond just clusters too, but more relevant to the hierarchy inside of the network structure that they are perceiving. So to illustrate that fact, what I'm showing you on the left-hand side is the same modular graph that I've shown you before, but now I've color-coded the edges so that I can distinguish between ones that are really inside of the module, and I'll call them the internal edges. It's shown in blue here. And then these sort of middling edges, they're shown in purple. I'll call them boundary because they connect to the edges that will eventually lead out of the cluster. And then in red, I show the cross-cluster edges. So these are 3 different sorts of edges that are present inside of the network. And what you can see on the right-hand side is that human reaction times differ significantly for those 3 bin types of edges. So on the right-hand side, what you see is a difference in reaction time along the y-axis, and then along the x-axis, we have 3 different box plots that compare pairwise different sorts of edges. First, I want you to notice that the reaction time difference is consistently above 0 for all of these comparisons. And then I want you to notice that the smallest difference is between the blue and the purple. So that's the really internal edges and the middling edges. And the biggest difference that we observe is between the blue and the red. So the blue being the very internal ones and the red ones being the cross cluster. So what this indicates is that humans are swiftest when responding to transitions in that internal triangle. They're sort of middling swift at responding to transitions that are purple, so in the middle, and then they're quite slow at the cross-cluster boundary. So this indicates that transitions between or at the boundaries of modules generate much more surprise, much more uncertainty than transitions deep inside of the module. And that could have been enough, but because it was suggestive that humans are perceiving some higher order structure in the network, we decided to ask the question of whether humans can respond differently to information that is presented from different kinds of networks. So what we did is that we showed a stream of stimuli that is taken from a random walk on the modular graph, or a random walk on this lattice graph that I'm showing you in yellow in the middle, or a random walk on an actual random network that again maintains k equals 4, meaning that every node still has exactly 4 connections. And what we found is that humans are swiftest when we present information through a random walk taken from the modular graph. So their responses to the modular graph were much faster. Responses to information presented in a lattice-like architecture were a little bit slower, and then responses when information was presented from a random network were slowest of all. So this suggests that humans are not just sensitive to the hierarchy, but they're also sensitive to the generic topology globally of the entire network. So together, I think these results reveal that humans process information far beyond entropy, and in a manner that depends systematically on the network topology. Now, to dig a little bit deeper into these ideas, I wanted to motivate the next section by reading this passage from Benson's Ruskin, A Study in Personality, where he says, you know how most of us in our idle moments, or perhaps even more in moments when we are officially supposed to be occupied, lapse into a reverie in which a stream of thought, it may be placid, it may be vehement, sweeps through the brain from the flushed reservoir of the mind. Suppose you check yourself suddenly in one of these reveries. Try to put into words what you have been thinking and as you thought it. You will find it to be ludicrously impossible. Half the thoughts have passed without clothing themselves in any vesture of word. One thing has suggested another, often enough by some trivial similarity of superficial form. The whole thing is evasive, elusive, irrecoverable. And what I think I like about this is that when we are perceiving information that is from our networked world, there are cognitive processes that we may or may not be aware of or that are going on consistently and that may be informing this perception of a higher order organization. So let's just ask the question, what is it that people are thinking that drives this response that is far from just the local organization inside of the information they are perceiving? Well, to answer that question, we decided to try to build a theory for what is it that humans are thinking. Here is our little human. It's a stick figure here at time t+1, and they're currently seeing stimulus x at t+1. And in order to build an expectation of their networked world, they need to understand the stimulus in front of them, but then also recall the stimulus that just happened so that they can build an expectation of the transition probability between those two stimuli. So we can build expectations about a network structure simply with a counts matrix, Nij, which just counts how many times have I seen stimulus I go to stimulus j. Now, let's suppose that humans were, ideal information processing systems, and they do something like maximum likelihood, which is what you would expect an artificial learning system to do. So they would use maximum likelihood estimation to estimate the transition probability matrix. Let's call it A hat MLE for maximum likelihood estimation. That would just be the counts matrix, so Nij, divided by the number of times that they've seen I go to any k. So they're going to count how many times have I seen node I go to node j, and divided by how many times I have seen node I go to any other stimulus. Now this provides a really beautiful, unbiased estimate of transition structure, but humans aren't doing this. And we know that because humans' reaction times depend systematically on these abstract features of the network, which are not predicted by maximum likelihood. Humans have in their mind something that's not the transition probability matrix. Remember, I showed you the modular graph and I showed you how they were very slow at these cross-cluster boundaries. If they had just been building a true transition probability matrix, then the transition probabilities on all edges would be 25% and that would be flat across the whole thing. The fact that humans are slower in certain spots in the network means that they're not doing maximum likelihood. Okay, so let's posit, what could humans be doing? Let's suppose that humans are maximizing accuracy, but trying to also minimize computational complexity. And these two features are fighting against one another. In order to completely maximize accuracy, you have to have a very complex computational model of your world. But if you try to completely minimize computational complexity, you will probably decrease accuracy in your predictions about your world. So these two features are probably trading off with one another. You can't have both. The competition between accuracy and computational complexity then leads to a maximum entropy or minimal complexity model of people's internal representations of events. So let's write it down. What does that mean formally? So what we can do is that we can write down the probability of recalling xt minus delta t rather than x of t. So in other words, when you're currently sitting at a stimulus, maybe you don't remember x of t, the previous stimulus, as driving what you're currently seeing. You remember something else that happened in the past, some delta t ago. We're going to write that probability as q of delta t. And then we can write down the error of the candidate probability distribution as E of Q. And then finally, we can write down the complexity of the error distribution just as the entropy. So we'll write down S of Q as the entropy of the error distribution. Then we can write down the free energy principle. So the total cost of the distribution is its free energy F, which is going to be equal to beta, which is a tuning parameter, times the error distribution E minus the entropy. Now the distribution that would minimize the free energy is the Boltzmann distribution P, which is written down here at the bottom with where beta is now the inverse temperature parameter. So this is a nice way of linking the computations that are occurring possibly occurring in someone's mind to a formal theory of free energy. Now, just to give you an intuition for what that means pictorially, I'm going to show you what happens in that model if a person's beta value is equal to 0, if it's equal to infinity, and if it's equal to something in the middle. So first, when beta goes to 0, that means that this person has absolutely no memory, and this minimizes mental resources, but also decreases their accuracy in responding to their environment. So here is our little human again. Their probability of remembering anything in the past as driving what they're currently seeing is flat. So they think that anything could have caused anything in their world. And so their expectation of the network is a fully connected graph. And I'm showing you that on the bottom of the slide here. Now I want to contrast that benchmark on the left-hand side with what happens when beta goes to infinity. In this particular case, the human will completely accurately remember precisely what happened in the previous moment as driving this transition. And so they will come up with a fully accurate expectation of the transition probabilities. And so I'm showing you that on the bottom. So when beta goes to infinity, their probability distribution is a delta function precisely on the previous moment. Now what happens in the middle? Let's say when beta is about 1, then we have this probability that falls off with time into the past. So we are likely to remember something that just happened as driving what we're currently seeing, but we're also somewhat likely to remember something farther in the past. And that probability falls off with time into the past. And if this is the probability distribution that we use, then our expectation of the graph is shown in the bottom in pink. So we are going to over anticipate the connections inside of a module. You can see they are dark lines inside the module, and we're going to under anticipate connections that go between modules. And you can see that by the fact that the edges that go between modules are lighter gray rather than the dark charcoal that's present inside of the modules themselves. And so this expectation would predict that swifter reaction time inside of a module and slower reaction time between modules. Now, what we want to do then is to take our model and fit it to data from the human participants to determine whether or not it fits the data well, and then what we can learn about human beta values. So what we do is that we measure this inverse temperature parameter beta from the reaction time data. And here's the distribution over our participants. So there were 358 participants in all that participated in this experiment. And what I'm showing you is that on the left-hand side of this graph, there were 71 individuals who had a beta value that we could not distinguish from 0. And so that was the flat line. Their reaction times suggested that they anticipated anything in the past as driving what they're currently seeing. And then we had 44 individuals whose beta values we could not distinguish from infinity. And then the majority of individuals, so 243 of them, had beta values that had a mean of 0.31 and a median of 0.06. So they were intermediary. So the large majority of people had this value of beta about 0.31. So that indicates that they're more on this probability function that falls off with time. And what's really interesting about that is that then we can go back into simulation and say, is there something special about a beta of 0.31? What sorts of expectations about a graph would occur if humans on average have a beta of about 0.31? And so what I'm showing you on the top is across many different beta values, what is the difference between the expected transition probabilities inside of a module versus between modules. And what you can see is that when beta is very small, there's no difference in expectations. When beta is very high, there's also no difference in expectations. But when beta is in the middle, you maximize this difference in expected transition probabilities between the intercluster edges and the intercluster edges. So this beta above about 3.1 that we see in humans is roughly the point at which you would most likely see this cross-cluster surprisal effect. So what that suggests to us is that we were just super lucky to see this, and it seems that it's something that humans show because their average beta value is about 0.3. We can also show on the bottom of this slide that if we do that same analysis but study where will we see the biggest reaction time difference between a modular graph and a lattice graph, it also happens only when beta is intermediate and about this 0.1 area. So that's really interesting. The next thing that I wanted to say is that, since this is a group of people interested in building theory for understanding behavior, what do you do when you've built a theory? You're not done once you've built it. The first thing that you usually want to do is to estimate the parameters of your model from real data. So it's important to develop the theory kind of just in your minds with the math, etc. But then you want to estimate the parameters from data. So we did that on the previous slide. So I'm going to put a check mark by 1. The next thing that you want to do is to validate the mechanism of the phenomenological theory. And then the third thing that you want to do is to use the theory to make a prediction about a new experiment. So I'm going to go to that second point. Let's see if we can validate the mechanism of the phenomenological theory. So what we need to be able to do is to measure the memory distribution in humans and ask if it looks the same as what our theory predicts. So a nice thing that we can do here is to consider a simple n-back working memory task, which is used in the field of psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience to understand the accuracy of a person's memory. The n-back task looks like this. So here's a sequence of stimuli, and the goal in the n-back task is to determine whether the current letter that you see is the same as the letter 2 before. Okay, so you're always seeing a letter, and you always have to say, is this the letter that I also saw 2 before? So you are, let's say here you are currently at A, and you must answer the question, did you see A 2 times ago? And you say yes. If you say yes, then you are incorrect because B was actually 2 times ago. If you say, you can also say yes because you confuse what happened 2 times ago with what happened 5 times ago. So the A actually happened 5 times ago. So this is a little bit of a confusion in time, right? You answered, yes, I saw A 2 times ago, but actually you saw A 5 times ago. Well, that delta T of 3 steps that you've kind of forgotten, that delta T is precisely what we need because that's what our probability distribution is of. Right? So what we can do is that we can go through simple responses to an n-back working memory task and extract what the human distribution, memory distribution is. Here, what I'm showing you on the top left is estimating or just writing down from the data, the probability of delta T as a function of delta T. And for the 1-back task, for the 2-back task, and then for the 3-back task. And what you can see is both the data, which is in the markers and the solid line, and then also what we would expect the data to look like if the human beta value was 0.33, and that's the best fit here on the left-hand side for the 1-back, and then again 0.33 for the 2-back, and then 0.29 for the 3-back, and that's again the dashed lines are fit to these data. If we then go and take all of those tasks together, the 1-back, the 2-back, and the 3-back, and collapse the probability distribution together, then we see what's given in black at the bottom of the slide. And here what you can see is that the beta value that we obtain from humans' responses to an n-back working memory task is about 0.32 plus or minus 0.01. So what's really neat about this is not only is the shape of the distribution what we would have anticipated or predicted from our model, but also the beta value that we obtained from a graph learning task is consistent with the beta value that we would obtain from an n-back working memory task. So this memory distribution we posit in the theory is consistent with the memory distribution that we observe in the experiment, and that validates the phenomenological theory. So the third thing that you want to do when you develop a theory is to test some predictions of a theory in a new experiment, all right? So that's what we're going to do here. In this experiment, what we reconsidered is the fact that if we are using maximum likelihood estimation as a guide, you might naively expect that people will be equally surprised by violations to their expectations because each violation has never been seen before. But if instead people are not doing maximum likelihood, but they are building this biased expectation of the transition probability matrix in kind with our model, then we would anticipate that humans will respond differently to short violations of their expectations than to long violations of their expectations. So to evaluate this prediction, we studied this ring graph that I'm showing you on the left-hand side, and we defined a short violation to be going through the experiment, and all of a sudden we transition between the white node and a blue node. Okay, so there are really no connections between a white node and a blue node. So any transition between those is a violation of the human expectations after they've learned this graph. But it's a relatively short violation in topological space. A long violation would be a transition between the white node at the top and one of the red nodes at the bottom. That's a very long violation. It's also something they've never seen before, so they should be surprised by it. And our prediction is that they will be more surprised by the long violation than by the short violation. So just to show that that is actually what we end up finding, we had 99 humans in this particular part of the experiment. I'm showing you along the y-axis their change in reaction time when we violate their expectations. And I first want you to focus on the blue and the red bars. Those show the reaction time difference in when they're shown a violation versus no violation. The blue one is the short violation and the red one is the long violation. And first, I just want you to note that those error bars do not include 0, which means that when we violate human expectations of the graph architecture by transitioning between two nodes where they haven't seen that kind of transition before, they slow down. They're uncertain, they're surprised, they slow down. They have a longer reaction time. But the key here in validating the theory is the bit on the right-hand side, the purple bar. And that is the comparison between a long violation and a short violation. Again, if they were just doing something like maximum likelihood, then we should not see any difference. This bar should include 0. And what we see is that it doesn't include 0, that humans are slower when responding to a long violation than when responding to a short violation. So that is a really nice a validation of a prediction from the theory itself. Now, to motivate the very last part of this story, I wanted to read to you this passage from Joseph Glanville in The Vanity of Dogmatizing, where he says, "But how is it, and by what art, doth the soul read that such an image or stroke in matter signifies such an object? Did we learn such an alphabet in our embryo state? And how comes it to pass that we are not aware of any such cognate apprehensions? That by diversity of motions we should spell out figures, distances, magnitudes, colors, things not resembled by them we attribute to some secret deductions." And I want to understand what are these secret deductions, and are these secret deductions ones that allow us to not just understand what happens in a laboratory, highly stylized laboratory experiment to understand graph learning, or is it something that allows us to understand colors and motions and all of the rich experiences and stimuli that we have in the world around us? And so to address that question, we wanted to move beyond the stylized laboratory experiment and study real information processing networks that are in the human experience. So to do that, what we said is that, well, if humans have this biased perception of networked structure, right? They do not recall or remember or respond in a way that tells us that they are understanding the true transition structure. They're doing something else. They're seeing the higher order structure. They're under expecting some edges and over expecting other edges. So if they're biased, this is a human bias, then what is their perception of a system, and how far is that perception away from the truth about the system? So for intuition's sake, let's write down what the perceived information is for a given transition probability matrix P. So what we can do is that we can write down the cross entropy between P, which is the true transition probability matrix, and P hat, which is the human's expectation of the transition probability matrix given their bias about their world, okay? And we're gonna say that that cross entropy is equal to the entropy itself, which is just based on the true graph, and then plus the KL divergence between the true graph and the human expectation. So this KL divergence is a measure of their inefficiency, the inefficiency of the observer's representation. And when we add up the entropy of the true network and the KL divergence, so how separate is the true network from the human perception of the network, we will get the cross entropy, or the perceived information. So what we can do is that we find that networks with identical entropy, so they're absolutely the same amount of entropy in these networks, they differ in terms of their cross entropy, with the modular graph actually having markedly low cross entropy. What's interesting about that is that it predicts our observation that human reaction times are swiftest on the modular graph. And so to show this, what I'm showing you on the right-hand side is the cross entropy as a function of eta, which is very It's a reparameterization of the beta value that I showed you earlier. And what we did is that we studied 805,491 K4 regular graphs, meaning that these are all of the graphs that have exactly 4 edges coming out of every node. And what we can see is that the cross entropy varies as you vary the beta value. So, how far someone's expectations are from the truth depends on their beta value. But then also, I just want you to notice that this purple line on the bottom of this graph is the modular network. So that is the graph that has the lowest KL divergence. So the smallest divergence from human expectations of any of the graphs that we studied. So what that suggests is that humans, it's possible that there are networks that are easier for humans to learn than others. And also it suggests that if we were to present information optimally to someone, perhaps we should consider showing that information to them in a modular way, in a way that's consistent with a modular architecture. Okay, now we wanted to go one step further to say, let's look at real information processing networks in language, in semantic relationships, in the World Wide Web, in citations, which is a reflection of scientific information flow, social relationships, and then music. In language, we're studying word transitions. So how does one word transition to another one? When you hear Peter, do you often think of rabbit? Perhaps yes, if your kids are in a particular age group. And in music, we're also studying note transitions. So when you hear one note, what is the transition that you will hear another note? That's going to differ significantly across eras of music composition, but also different composers as well. But we decided to just take a very large smattering of music. You can see we have Thriller by Michael Jackson, Hard Day's Night by the Beatles, Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen, Africa by Toto, and then several classical pieces as well. And what we did is that we studied both their entropy and their KL divergence to say, is it possible that these information systems are ones that are very close to human expectations, where our biases are not making a huge difference between the true network and the perceived network? So on the left-hand side of this graph, what I'm showing you is the entropy along the y-axis of a random network of the same size as our true networks. And along the x-axis, I'm showing you the entropy of the real network. And what you can see is that all of these data points lie below the unity line, which means that the real networks have much more entropy than is expected in a random graph of the same size. What does that mean? It means that these types of information processing systems or communication systems are packing in a lot of information. And perhaps that's because we're using them and have used them over long periods of time, optimized them to share information with one another. On the right-hand side, what I'm showing you is a similar graph layout, but for the KL divergence. So that's the divergence of the true transition probability matrix from the perceived transition probability matrix given human bias. And here what you can see is the real KL divergence on the x-axis, the KL divergence of a random graph along the y-axis, and then the dashed gray line is the unity line. What you notice is that all of the data points are in the above the unity line, which means that these real networks have very low KL divergence in comparison to a random graph of the same size. So what that means is that they're actually quite close to what human expectations would be. The human bias doesn't affect them very much. I can show you just that exact same data, but in box plots instead, to accentuate the differences between different sorts of networks. So in dark blue, we have the language networks, and then over on the right-hand side, we have the social networks in red and the music networks in purple. What I want to call your attention to is the fact that language networks have the largest amount of entropy. They have this really big entropy bar. They have much more entropy than expected in the random graph. And I think that's interesting because language is something that we as humans use to present a lot of information in a short amount of time. Then I want you to notice the KL divergence specifically of the music networks and the social networks. So that's in the bottom right-hand portion of this slide. And you can see that they actually have relatively large amounts of KL divergence, larger than the language one. And that means that they're a little bit while they're close to our expectations, they're not as close as the language networks. And I wonder whether that has something to do with the fact that we use social networks and music networks for entertainment, for novelty, and for surprise. And that in fact, sometimes that's important for these particular components of our human experience. So it raises the interesting question of whether there are selection pressures that are different for these different sorts of information processing systems that would push one to pack in more information, and then to push another one to be either closer or farther away from our expectations, to either maximize the efficiency of information transmission or broaden our horizons a bit. The last thing that I will show you is that the KL divergence is lower than in degree preserving null models. So this is just in case you wanted to dig in deeply into what kind of random network null models we're using. In the previous slides, I used just fully Erdős-Rényi random graphs. Here I'm using a random graph that has the same degree distribution as the true networks. And what we can see is that the KL divergence of the true networks is still much lower than expected in these degree preserving networks. The entropy is the same, and that's by definition because the entropy of the graph is related to the degree distribution. Okay, so that brings us to the summary of what we've gone over the last couple minutes. The first point I wanted to bring us back to at the very beginning of the talk is that humans can learn the architecture of networks underlying continuous streams of information. This is something that humans can do, and humans appear to do very easily, amazingly. Number two, humans display expectations that diverge from the true network, indicating that they are not performing simple maximum likelihood computations. Number three, a free energy principle that the brain minimizes errors and computational complexity produces a memory distribution, specifically the Boltzmann distribution, that is consistent with empirical measurements from the NBAC working memory task. Number four, real networks are organized to communicate large amounts of information, so they have very high entropy, but they do so efficiently given human biases, so they have very low KL divergence from human expectations. And finally, efficient communication is supported by hierarchically modular architecture, hinting at a general explanation for the hierarchical organization observed in many human communication systems. We do have some initial evidence that I did not include because it's preliminary, that the capacity to perform graph learning is something that is present in very young kids, including around 4 or 5 years old. But we also have preliminary data suggesting that the beta values of humans change significantly over development. So although those data are not sort of ready for prime time here, I did want to mention that these approaches are ones that seem to be relevant for a large part of the lifespan, and also modulated by developmental processes. So just to give a pictorial summary of what we did, we started with Robert McFarland, who's a nature writer and a professor at the University of Cambridge. We talked a lot about network learning experiments, and then took a transition across Arthur Benson, who's an essayist and poet from the 1800s and early 1900s. We talked a little bit about network learning theory. How can we develop a theory that explains our experiments and that also makes predictions about new experiments? And then finally, we transitioned across Joseph Glanville, who's a writer and philosopher from the 1600s, into human information processing. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the people who were very important in the work, and specifically these three stellar people. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you Liz Caruza, who's now an assistant professor of psychology at the Pennsylvania State University. And then Ari Khan is a graduate student in neuroscience. He's just about to graduate. He has a postdoc lined up at Princeton University. And then Chris Lin, he is no longer actually a graduate student in physics. He's now a postdoc, and he's funded by a James S. McDonnell Foundation Fellowship. And with that, I think I am done what I wanted to tell you about, and I would love to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you, Danielle, so much for these fascinating results. We have a question from Sarah.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thanks so much, though. This was super interesting. I'm wondering if you've looked at any data in populations with disorders, maybe with disordered memory or social interactions, things like that, and what these, I mean, kind of, I could imagine that these divergences might be a little different depending on what disorders you look at. Do you have any data on that, or could you speculate on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We actually wrote a grant recently. It's currently being evaluated at NIH to take this into, well, to expand the model more and then to eventually take it into populations with psychiatric conditions. And largely that's because, you know, the link to the NBAC working memory task is really nice. And I didn't show this data, but we showed in the paper that there's a correlation between NBAC working memory performance and the beta value on a graph learning task. So that suggests that there's a connection between people's capacity to learn these graphs and broader notions of executive function, which we know are altered across a wide range of psychiatric conditions. So our hypothesis is that this kind of learning will be altered in those groups. Precisely how, we don't yet know because we don't have the data. One bit of information, you mentioned, you know, different people who have different social cognition processes may respond differently as well. I didn't talk about the social version of this task, but if you look at Steve Thompson's work, he shows in one of his early papers that there are major individual differences in how people learn these networks when the stimuli are social. And in fact, what he shows is that you can predict the humans' ability to see the larger scale structure in these networks by a questionnaire that evaluates to what degree they make more individualistic decisions versus collectivistic decisions. And so using that questionnaire, he was able to show that humans who tend to make decisions that are more for the collective or more for the group also tend to have a much better perception of the higher order structure inside of these networks, suggesting that they see the bigger structure here, just like they're using the bigger structure in their social networks to make their decisions. So that's a really interesting, I mean, it's preliminary in the sense that it's a single study and certainly needs to be replicated, but it's a really interesting suggestion that perhaps this relatively stylized experiment can provide us with insights into how people are making decisions differently from different social or cultural backgrounds or perspectives.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you.
Further questions? Actually, there's one thing I was wondering. I mean, it's just fascinating that people can learn or extract these regularities from the environment. One thing that I think you didn't mention is how much experience and exposure people actually need in order to extract those. Can you say something about the learning curve until one can see these traces of that? And the second thing is, how are these structures that people somehow integrate in their behavior, how are they represented? Are people conscious of those, or is it more like in really implicit knowledge that people are acquiring here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the reaction time on these experiments tends to follow a exponential or maybe even a double exponential, so consistent with many other learning curves. So we usually ignore the first 500 stimuli and then just focus on the next 1,000. Most of our experiments are 1,500 stimuli altogether. And the second point that you asked is whether humans have explicit knowledge of the network architecture or implicit knowledge. We did, in our experiments, we did ask them some open-ended questions about what they thought the experiment was about, and we didn't see any evidence in their responses that they had any explicit knowledge of what we meant for them to do, or what the organization of the network was, or even that there was a network underneath of it. So I think it's probably largely implicit. There is some really nice work from Anna Shapiro and from Tim Barron's group that suggests that the place in which these architectures are being stored is in the hippocampal entorhinal system. So there's a really nice paper by Gabbert et al. 2017 in eLife that I really like, that shows that there are specific parts of the hippocampal entorhinal system that are either coding for whether two nodes are connected or not connected, and then there's a separate part that's coding for whether the two nodes are close by in topological space or far away in topological space. So there does seem to be an explicit neuronal coding of this information, but not necessarily an explicit understanding that participants can verbalize. I'm a little hesitant, though, to say that they have no understanding, just because it's very possible that most of our participants have never taken a network science course or seen a graph like this or be able to put this into words. So I think that, claiming definitively that they have no explicit knowledge is difficult when the vocabulary might be hard for them to access.
I mean, I was reminded of some experiments in implicit learning where it was about the order in which certain letters occur. And there, the idea is that people get, or that they can become conscious of a structure by the fluency of their motor responses. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether that's possible in your experiments, but that's one route maybe by which people can say there's something going on here.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder if we just have to go out a little bit longer to see that. That's a great suggestion. Yeah, because if you start noticing in yourself that you do several movements very swiftly, and then you pause, and then you do several other movements really swiftly, maybe you would notice that there's a chunking that's occurring. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I will think about that, and maybe we just need to go longer than we're currently going.
Okay, we'd like to open the floor for also questions from the broader audience, and I think there's already a question by Jagmeet Kanwal. Are you switched on?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So that was really a fascinating talk. Thanks for that. I was curious for the end-back task, instead of just providing discrete letters, if you actually have something that is more related to concepts, such as maybe a fruit and then a vegetable, and when the vegetable or the fruit shows up again, so now you would be going from perhaps local networks or modules to across different modules. And I'm curious, what would that do to the learning curve? Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, so I guess one quick thing I will say is that the work that's being done in really young kids is using little aliens rather than movements. And that's work that's led by Alison Mackey's lab, and the graduate student who's leading the work is Ursula Tooley. So certainly you can use pictures that have conceptual backgrounds to them. One trick with doing that is that obviously we know there is some prior knowledge about fruit or possibly about aliens. And so in these initial experiments, we wanted to use stimuli that people would have no prior knowledge of, so that we can maximize sensitivity to just the learning that's happening from sort of a blank slate, rather than trying to see learning on top of existing structures of concepts. But it is really interesting to ask, how does, if we are currently, we're always learning, right? And we already, all of us have existing structures of concepts. So we are now learning in a way that molds those existing structures in a new way, depending on our new exposures. So how are there ways that we can study that? There's a paper that Liz Caruza has submitted recently that basically pits two things against one another: the temporal contingencies of stimuli and the visual similarity of stimuli. So you can say, if I have stimuli that have some very apparent visual similarities, or in your case, you could say they have conceptual similarities, then will people respond more to the conceptual similarity pattern or the temporal similarity or temporal contingency pattern? And can we, tune which of them people are noticing more by how much visual similarity is present versus not? And so what she finds is that there is an interesting intersection between those two components. I think there's a lot more to do, because in truth, in the real world, we are not starting with a blank slate in most of the things that we're learning now. And so we need to understand how we layer on different kinds of information and types of similarity. It could be visual similarity, conceptual similarity, auditory similarity, temporal similarity, right? They can all be happening at the same time, and they may each have very different network architectures. And so there's a big open space of understanding how and which ones people are most sensitive to, when and why. So I don't have a great answer except to say that that's a good question, and I think an important direction for the work.
Thanks. Yeah, that's useful. Thanks.
We have a question by Robert Scholz. Please.
Yes, hello. So thanks for the talk. I was wondering, so you showed some human empirical betas, and you had like those two starkly different outlier groups, like the humans with beta equaling 0 and beta equaling infinity. Do you think that there's like something inherently different in those groups, or is it like something task specific, like the beta group with zeros just did not pay attention to the task? But I mean, I cannot really like explain anything for the infinity ones. Are they like special in some sense? Is there like differences in genetic markup, differences in education, or what could be the reason for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in truth, it's probably the fact that there are 3 bins, maybe to some degree a finite size effect. I think that if we were able to get millions of participants, we should see a peak and then a fall off towards the tails. And we would see people who are close to 0 and people who are close to infinity. But the fact that we have limited information from each of them and a limited pool of participants means that we end up getting these 3 bins. Now, what explains why people were in each of the bins? I think that people who had the beta equals 0, maybe they didn't care about the task. Maybe they knew they were going to be paid anyway, and so they just answered randomly and they didn't engage. It's hard to know, why that is the case, but certainly if they're not paying attention and they're just responding randomly to get it done so that they can get paid, then you will get a beta of 0. The beta equals infinity people are really interesting. We don't have a lot of additional information on that group. I think it would be great to go back and give them a full neurocognitive battery. Genotyping would be really neat. But there also may be an explanation, a simpler explanation that I want to rule out first, which is that that particular task was a motor task. And I wished that we had asked people if they were musicians or if they were video game players, because I'm curious whether the people who were the infinity people are ones that are very trained to respond motorically very swiftly to very local information. So those, that could be very interesting variation or less interesting variation depending on their backgrounds and their prior experiences. So that's where I think we're going to go first, is to give the full neurocognitive battery and questions about experiences related to both musicianship and video gaming. And then maybe in a follow-up, we could go into genotyping.
Okay, seems very nice. So the follow-up is already planned, or?
The full neurocognitive battery is, yeah. And we're taking it into adolescence as well, which I'm excited about.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot.
Okay, next is Marco Vitica. Marco?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering if you have studied any of these inter-individual differences in behavioral learning in this network-based task in relation to brain network architecture?
Yes, so we have one paper that's from Steve Thompson. He's the first author in NeuroImage. And in that one, he uses the social network learning task and has them do it inside of the scanner. And so what we can see is that he has some people doing the social network version of the learning task and another set of people who do the non-social version, and he compares the two against one another. And what we find is that in the social network learning condition, there are regions of strong functional connectivity that come out in social processing regions like temporal parietal junction and other related areas, whereas in the case, the consistencies in both the non-social and the social version, we see a very strong functional connectivity from the hippocampal entorhinal system, which is just important for I think the memory and the encoding of the graph architecture itself. So in that study, he uses PPI, so psychophysiological interaction, to identify which functional edges, so which functional connections between different brain regions are related to this cross-cluster surprisal effect, so the slowing at the cross-cluster boundaries. So the findings are specific to sensitivity to the architecture.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a final question from Ulman Lindenberg. Ulman, please.
Thanks for a very informative and also aesthetically appealing talk. I would like to come back to the beta distribution.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very speculative question. What if we could also think of this distribution as something that may vary within people, such that they sometimes might be advantages to be very verbatim, so to say, to have a beta higher than 0.30, and sometimes we may be in this mode where ideas are less connected and make jumps and are closer to a random state, which, however, may reveal surprising things and lead to new ideas. So basically, could there be a functional value of having a range, a within person range of a beta rather than a fixed beta?
Yes, I think that is definitely something that could be the case. What your question makes me think of is a paper that we recently submitted that's about curiosity and about how humans walk through Wikipedia networks. So we had humans browse Wikipedia for 20 minutes a day for 3 weeks. So we have hours and hours and hours of data on each person. And we study the degree to which they're walking between pages that are nearby in some conceptual space or far away in conceptual space. And we have a computational model where we are able to show that some people are more hunter-like in the sense that they are really walking through Wikipedia in a way that suggests that they're taking steps that are nearby and towards a goal. Whereas other people are more sort of busybodies. They read a page here and then they jump to a page here and then they jump to a page here, and etc. So we do have an ongoing data collection where we're using that same Wikipedia task to study variability in human curiosity as how they are gathering information on an existing knowledge network structure, and having them do a graph learning experiment so that we can assess their beta value. We do show in the first study that there is, if we separate the data into the first week and a half and the second week and a half, there is some high interclass correlation coefficient, or moderate, I would say. So people who are curious in one way in the first week and a half tend to be curious in the same way in the second week and a half, but it's not a perfect correlation. There's a lot of day-to-day variability and week-to-week variability. And so I imagine that would also be present in the way that people are responding to the graph learning experiments, meaning that beta is going to vary day to day and week to week. So it would be really nice to be able to show that. I mean, I think that if all of us think about how how we do scientific research, how we follow the lines of scientific inquiry and curiosity, it is, you know, at the very beginning of a project, we are thinking with a very open mind. We're sort of drawing in ideas from very disparate places. And then we try to hone in on a particular question and a very specific hypothesis, and then make very sequential steps that are nearby. And then when we get to the end of the study and we're writing up the discussion of our paper, then we broaden out again and say, oh, well, what might this be relevant for? And what might this suggest in a more speculative fashion? And so I do think that there are, you know, a good scientist probably has the capacity to switch between these different modes of search and acquisition. And so I imagine that a variable beta is something that would be good for us as humans.
Thanks.
I mean, just to add to that, I think that would even be adaptive. I mean, wonder what you think about it, because I mean, at least when you're entering a domain, it's very good to be explorative, right? And understand the beta parameter is reflecting kind of exploratory behavior that then will wane and get a bit lower or higher in that sense, the more one already is familiar with the domain.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
Okay, we're coming to the close of this week's session. Danielle, thanks so much for this great talk.
Thank you for having me.
It was a great pleasure. It was very interesting. Thank you to all of us, to all of you who were with us today. And next week we will have Iyad Ravan, who is a director at the MPI in Berlin, and he will talk about machine behavior. It would be great to see you then again. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.